Hello and welcome to my Guild Wars 2 First Impressions, and impressed would be an operative word here. Yes, I've pre-ordered the game and therefore was able to spend some time in this weekend's beta, although not nearly as much time as I would have liked. I did get to experience a lot of what the game has to offer in my first 12 or so hours of play, which actually brings up the very first positive point about Guild Wars 2 right off the bat. There is a ton of stuff to do in this game, and you can start experiencing it immediately. If there was ever a game that did not pigeonhole you into a particular kind of gaming experience for your first 100 hours, this is it. Well, unless you just get this. Yeah, there's not much variety in this. Now, currently in Guild Wars 2, you do not have the option to choose more than one server. You choose one server and get up to 5 characters on that server, and that's it. You're stuck. Now, I haven't read the official word from ArenaNet about why these lockouts happened, but what it looks like to me is that Guild Wars 2 probably hasn't implemented a queuing system yet for when the server is full. And since you don't get to choose an alternate server to play on when your server is full, you just get this. And if you are on a high population server, you can get this all day. Now, I have no doubt that ArenaNet will implement a queuing system soon, but it appears to me that they do not intend to let you play on multiple servers, and you cannot change servers without paying for a transfer. Now, if I'm correct on this, in my opinion, this has got to change. This is one of those customer service issues that could give Guild Wars 2 a serious black eye, since I've never played a game that didn't let me play on multiple servers, and being stuck on an overpopulated server with, say, 2 hours of queue every time I want to play, well, that would be a nightmare. But on with the first impression. As is always the case with a new game, the first impression is the character creation. In Guild Wars 2, you get to choose from 5 different races, although in this beta we only got to see 3, the Norn, the Char, and the Human. You have the standard option for newer games, which is to say that you get to adjust different facial features, tattoos, hairstyles, body types, etc., etc. So although it's nothing special, it also doesn't leave an awful lot to be desired, like a certain other AAA MMORPG title released recently. You also get to choose the color patterns for your armor, although you'll be able to change this whenever you want throughout the game. If I have a complaint about the customization, it's probably the colors. I was unable to find color schemes that I really liked, as the choices are somewhat limited to dingy grays or bright colors with very little in between. And once you've selected the look of your character, you'll get to decide what kind of character he is for role-playing purposes through a series of questions. How you answer these questions will impact your personal storyline quest progression throughout the game. Now, I don't yet know how much of an impact it is. For example, if I change the answer to one of these questions, will it give me an entirely different set of personal story quests? Well, I didn't have time to mess with multiple characters, so I don't have an answer for this yet. But from what I've seen, I think you'll get more variety than what a certain other AAA MMORPG title promised and underdelivered. Now, I have to say that for me, the other operative word for this beta weekend was confused. Just about everything in this game is different from anything I've ever played, and sometimes it seemed it's just for the sake of being different. For example, instead of exclamation marks identifying quest givers, Guild Wars 2 uses hearts. Now, I could care less about hearts. If they want to use hearts, then use hearts. The only problem is that where most MMORPGs are familiar enough that you can dive right in and figure things out, Guild Wars 2 is the first MMORPG I've played in years where I felt like I needed a written manual. I spent a lot of the weekend just stumbling around trying to figure things out. Now, this is not to say I didn't enjoy it. I had a blast playing Guild Wars 2 and can't wait until the next beta. But I think I would have enjoyed it a little more if they'd have not tweaked things that really didn't need tweaking. But more on this later. Now, I'll just touch on graphics and sound briefly. Combat animations are great, and the ability effects look fantastic. I really loved the look of the world, too, especially at a distance, as everything looks rather picturesque. Now, I thought characters themselves were probably the weakest aspect of the graphics. Faces in particular look a little flat and cartoonish. All in all, I don't think these graphics quite come up to the level of Terra, but if I'm a betting man, I'd bet that people will appreciate the art style in Guild Wars 2 more than Terra's, and probably more than most games on the market. As for sound, I honestly didn't even notice it until I started working on this video. Suddenly I realized I hadn't noticed the sound at all and thought, that's gotta be a good thing, right? So in going back and watching various selections from my weekend, I discovered that the sound is indeed a very good thing. Everything sounds just like it ought to. The sounds in combat are varied, and all of them sound real, yet they are not overwhelming to the point of distraction. Environment sounds are fantastic. The music is very good when it's used, but it certainly is not overused to where you'll end up turning it off because it gets redundant. Whoever is responsible for the sound in this game deserves a raise. Anyway, off I went looking for adventure in the Norn starting area, and I found it around every turn. Now, if you've heard that this is just like every other game in that you have quest hubs that you pick up your quests from, run out and complete them, and come back to turn in your 10 rat furs and 20 boar tusks, well, you've been misled. Either people saying this haven't played the game, or they don't understand the definition of the word hub. When you're out adventuring in Guild Wars 2, you have a couple of ways you can go. You can either just go exploring with a blank map and come across quests as you happen to find them, or you can talk to a scout who will show you the locations of quest givers, and as you can see, they're really spread out. But either way, you'll usually get one quest giver in an area, and I found the quests to be really varied. You might kill stuff, you might gather stuff, you might get in snowball fights, you might have to carry sacks of food while trying to figure out how to avoid hungry bunnies. And yes, this one was actually quite challenging as it involved using dodge, speed bursts, and a very fast use of scaring the bunny, but only after it had already knocked you over, something which took me a while to figure out. Beyond your regular quests, you'll also run across events frequently. Events will usually have a couple of parts to them and often require you to gather a bunch of stuff, and then protect the stuff you gathered by fighting a ton of mobs. Now, these events will require large teams, and they are a ton of fun. Now, I'm not certain how this will play a year after launch when the lower zones are certain to be underpopulated. Now, I know that zones scale in Guild Wars 2, so when you're at max level, you can come back to any zone and still be challenged, but for me, I'd only be able to do these events so many times before I never wanted to see them again, and I can't help but wonder what ArenaNet will do when its experienced population develops zone event fatigue. Perhaps they can scale the events so that if only one person is in the area, then it will be soloable? But whatever, that's a worry for ArenaNet and for people who don't buy this game at launch. As for right now, zone events are great fun and are just one reason why I am not regretting my pre-purchase of this game. Beyond the quests and the zone events, the world really does feel alive. When you overhear a conversation in a town, it's a real conversation, and almost always entertaining and worth stopping to listen to. Gone is the typical random MMO dialogue that sometimes brings up a tidbit of lore, but usually is just there to give the illusion of life. In Guild Wars 2, it seems that every random person you meet is real, fleshed-out character. In an obvious example, here is Sven initiating a zone event in which he wants everyone to gather him some ore. But Sven does not live in this spot, nor does he just magically appear for this event. Sven is a weaponsmith who lives over here, and Sven will actually run to this zone event to start it and run back when it's finished. Conversations usually mean something as well and tell you not only who that character is, but what they're like. You'll hear one very talkative child complaining about how much his friend talks. Or you'll hear a guy talk about how much work he has to do, but that he needs to take a nap first. And you'll see people actually move from one location to another to talk to each other rather than just standing next to each other all the time having the same conversation over and over and over. It probably doesn't sound like much to hear me tell it, but it's a wonderful in-game experience because you feel like you actually want to get to know these characters. It is just another example of how the developers of this game really care about their world. It feels like they crafted it the way a great writer crafts a novel in which every detail has a purpose. Now, another major element to the game is the personal story, and this is probably the aspect that I liked the least. I decided to make my character a thief who is smart, thinks on his feet, prefers cunning solutions to fighting, and doesn't like to draw attention to himself. But when I got into the game, I realized that the Norn story is always going to be about glory, fighting, and fame, which not only flies in the face of how I envisioned my character, but also flies in the face of how I answered the questions when I created my character. If the Norn storyline is always going to have me clamoring for glory and recognition, then why would the character creation allow me to choose subterfuge, which is described as the ability to blend into the crowd and go unnoticed? And that's one of my primary attributes. Now, for that matter, why would being a thief even be an option for a Norn? This is one of the reasons why I have yet to see a personal story that works in an MMO. In a game like World of Warcraft or City of Heroes, there is no written personal story beyond the standard "you are chosen" type of plot. So when I create my character, imagine what his personality is like, and develop his backstory, I can then imagine why he does everything he does and how he would respond to every situation, because those responses aren't usually written out in any kind of detail. So that allows me to be able to relate to or identify with my character. When personal stories are written for me in an MMO like Guild Wars 2, inevitably my character ends up doing stuff or responding to people in ways that are completely different than the character I've imagined, and I end up feeling detached, like I'm playing someone else's character and not my own. The single-player RPGs avoid this to an extent because they usually give you a framework for your character before you start playing. And generally, you have enough backstory written that you then develop your character's imagined personality around what you already know about him. MMOs have yet to navigate personal stories successfully, and Guild Wars 2 is no exception. So although my personal story is interesting and well written, it is also the aspect I care least about because my character is a thief who moves in the shadows and goes unnoticed. The guy in the personal story, though, he's a glory hound, and that's a stranger to me. I don't want to know him, let alone play him. Beyond the issues with immersion, though, there are fundamental problems with the personal story in Guild Wars 2 that should be addressed, but quite possibly won't be before launch. Now, first, we have the cutscenes that, although well written and nicely voiced, make you feel like you're playing a Nintendo game from 1988. Now, you'll notice this little sign up here that says "Work in Progress." Hopefully, this whole stand in front of a backdrop that completely takes you out of your game experience thing will be remedied before launch. Next, there is some problematic progression. In this section of the story, I was supposed to save a Minotaur spirit by killing everything around him. I got some companions to go with me, and this should have been fun and challenging. Well, first my companions died, and then I died, and died, and died, and yeah, well, you get the picture. This went from fun to tedious to downright anger-inducing. Now, you'd think that maybe I'm just not powerful enough for this part of the game yet and should have done this later, but this is not the case. First off, I out-leveled the foes in this portion of the story. Second, in the very next section of the personal story, I got to get a bunch of foes drunk off ale and then fight them a handful at a time. I did this section of the story immediately after the death-inducing section and had very little problem with it at all. Now, sometimes Guild Wars 2 does expect you to think outside the box, and you do need to use objects within the environment or tactical strategies to accomplish your goal, so it's possible that I just missed the solution here. Regardless, having the personal storyline go from easy to extreme and back to easy without any real warning of which sections are just ho-hum and which are brutally difficult seems like a mistake, and certainly puts yet another damper on me wanting to partake in my personal story. And now back to the good stuff. And at this point, I'll take a moment to describe combat. Your skills are largely based on your weapon set. The weapon you're using comes with the 5 skills that you see on the bottom left bar. Now, when you first get the weapon, you only have one of these, but as you use it, it will open up the other 4 relatively quickly. The skills are really varied too, so you will definitely get an opportunity to choose a playstyle that suits you. Now, the skills on the right, those are ones that you'll purchase using skill points that you acquire in the open world. There are 5 slots for these that will open as you level. Eventually, you'll have a ton of abilities available, but you'll have to choose which 5 you want to use in different situations. You also gain the ability to swap weapon sets, I believe at level 7, which allows you to combine even more skills together. So for example, you could start with a long-range set where someone comes in melee range, you could switch to short range. Or perhaps you could stealth in close and do some massive melee damage, followed by an ability that jumps you out of range after you've incapacitated your foe, and then switch to your ranged weapons to finish them off. Now, I'd show you examples of this, but I pretty much spent the weekend in noob mode, to put it mildly, and never quite managed to chain my abilities in any impressive fashion. Now, combat in general was a huge piece of my confusion in this game, as that took me a while to figure out. And even now, I don't quite know how it all works. For example, my first dagger had a certain set of skills. My second dagger had a different set of skills. My second dagger was more powerful than my first, so I definitely wanted to use it, but I was accustomed to my first set of skills and wanted to use them. Now, I wouldn't have thought this would be a problem because I have the ability to dual wield my daggers. But as soon as the second was equipped, regardless of which hand I put it in, it overrode the skills of the first dagger. So in the end, those skills were no longer available to me. And I found this to be pretty much the case whenever I dual wielded weapons. The game chose for me which weapon skills I'd be using. Now there might be something I'm missing here because, well, I'm confused. Or this might just be how it works, in which case I'm slightly annoyed. Still, the combat system overall is very well designed, so in the big scheme of things, this is a small complaint. I'm sure I'll find a weapon set that I really love. Now, what I will say about this combat is that it definitely favors the more twitchy, fast-reacting kind of player, and not the more cerebral and exacting type of player like myself. People who have lightning reflexes are going to love this. People more like myself might not so much. As for me, I love it so far because the fast-action combat that utilizes movement, tactics, dodging, and a wise selection of skills makes for a very refreshing change. Whether or not I'll still love it 3 months from now, or if I'll decide I much prefer the World of Warcraft style of combat that I can control easier, remains to be seen. But now that I've described the combat in Guild Wars 2, I can move on to my final section in this first look, the PvP. A lot of people will probably be disappointed at the lack of open-world PvP, and yet, PvP is an aspect of Guild Wars 2 that really shines in my opinion. There are a couple of different styles of PvP. First off, there is a skirmish type of PvP where you are on a team playing against another team in a small group. You can enter these arenas instantly, and when you arrive, you'll find that you are suddenly a level-capped character with appropriate weapons and a wide selection of skills. Now, this can be really disorienting at first because you have to relearn your skills and hotkeys. But once you have the hang of how combat plays in general, adjusting to your new skills in PvP becomes a lot easier. Now, these arena-style maps are fairly standard. You have points of interest that you need to capture while you kill enemies. The maps themselves are very detailed and allow for a lot of strategic use of the environment and are an improvement over most games just in terms of how the maps are laid out. Now, the other type of PvP is the world versus world versus world. If you go to the PvP lobby, which I think is the same thing as the Mists, you can get to the training area, which is sort of a waste of time because it, by itself, is really confusing. Now, I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing in the training area or how to, I guess, complete it, but from there you can take a portal into the massive world PvP. Now, in here, you'll get some extra health and such, but you'll have just whatever gear you carry and whatever skills you've unlocked. Now, I'm just going to take you through one of my experiences. I noticed on the map that my blue team was getting destroyed by the red team here in the Eternal Battlegrounds. The Eternal Battlegrounds are in the center of this massive PvP world. There are also realms for each of the 3 factions, which are basically separate instances, and there can be massive battles going on in all of them at the same time. Now, in our world, red pretty much controlled all of its territory, plus much of green's territory, and almost all of the Eternal Battlegrounds in the middle. My blue team, fortunately, was at least holding our own against the red onslaught in our own territory. But here in the Eternal Battlegrounds, we had decided to just assault the front gates of the main keep that red controlled. Now, to do this, as you can see, you need a large force. The gates are strong, and you get lots of fire and nastiness rained down upon you when you try to storm the castle. But we were making good headway, though, and finally broke through, only to find another gate, and this one was just nasty. There is a hole right above this gate where people are dropping fire and what looks like hot tar, and since our team was funneled right into this small area, we were just slaughtered. Oh, and by the way, from inside the gates, players are able to repair the damage that's being done from the outside. So whatever damage you do can be repaired fairly quickly when your army is dead. Now, it was about this time that a handful of us realized the futility of our efforts and decided to go attack this small tower instead. Now, the tower was not being defended at all by the players on the red team, who were having far too much fun tarring the bulk of our blue army, and they happily let it fall. After we took the tower, it sort of dawned on me that these walls could be targeted, which meant that the walls of the keep could be targeted as well. And what was even better was that the trebuchet that was set up outside the newly acquired tower was within range of the walls and could do massive damage to them. So fairly soon, a small group of blues had broken through to the inside of the keep, pretty much unnoticed, while our more brutish allies were still banging on the front doors, completely unaware of our success, which was probably a good thing for us, at least while it lasted. But when we hit the interior gate, we finally drew the attention of our red foes, and then we had too much for our little force to handle, and time was also running out on this beta weekend for us to attempt another assault. But at least, I am now armed with some new wartime strategies for the next beta test, and I look forward to implementing them. Now, one last note on PvP and general confusion, and I know that I'm not the only person who had this problem. Once you are in the PvP world, getting out, how do you get out? To the best of my knowledge, there is no button that you can push and no quick exit. So if you're playing and you find yourself stuck in a PvP zone, here's the only way I've found to return to the world at large, and hopefully I'll be made aware of an easier way. What I did was to go into the menu and click on Be in the Mists, which again is evidently also referred to as the PvP lobby. From there, you can go back into the exact same window in your menu and click Leave the Mists, which takes you back out into the world. At any rate, confusion aside, Guild Wars 2 is certainly one of the best games I've played. Period. Now, I can't say definitively where it will rank on my all-time list once I've had the opportunity to play more, because I simply didn't see enough of the world nor experience enough combat. So whether or not I'll end up liking it better than Rift, which is still my game of choice, I honestly have no idea. What I can say is that without a doubt, the $60 cost of entry is going to be worth every penny. Guild Wars 2 on its surface looks like it's going to be one of the truly great games, and I'm not sure I could recommend it highly enough. And that's it for my Guild Wars 2 first impression. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.